Hi there. In this quick tip video, I'm going to show you how to preserve your UV channel when using the Geometry Nodes Modifier and instanced geometry. So I've got two objects in my scene. I've got a sphere, which is mapped to the bottom right corner of my UV space. And I've got in the spreadsheet, if you go to face corner, I've got a UV map attribute that shows a bunch of UV data. And then in the object data, you can see that that attribute is in the UV maps section. Likewise, for my cube, I've got the cube cross layout. We've got the UV map attribute in the UV maps section. And then in the spreadsheet, you can see that there's data for each one of my points. So if I select both of these and go to edit mode, you can see that this will be my final layout for my UVs once we combine both of these meshes in Geometry Nodes. The only other thing that's on my cube here is the modifier for geometry nodes. And the way I have that set up currently is to have the input geometry go directly into the output geometry. So what I'm putting in is what I'm getting out. So if I hit apply here, you'll notice that if I go here, we've got our UV cross and it's still in our UV map section with our UV map attribute, and none of this data has changed. Great. So the next thing to do is instance this sphere on each one of these points. So we've got a reference to our sphere. We're going to instance on points. We're going to use the input geometry, which is the cube, as those points, and we're going to join that together, and we're going to use that as our output. So we've got a standard geometry with instance geometry joining together. And as you can see here in the viewport, we've got a sphere on each one of those points. If I go to edit mode and move around one of my verts, you'll see that that sphere is still on that point wherever I move it, which is awesome, exactly what we want. But if we go to our UV mode, you'll notice that we still only have 24 points and only the cube cross as far as our data goes. Our UV map is in our UV maps section, which is cool. So let's see what happens when we apply this modifier. So if I go to object mode and I drop down and apply, you'll notice that the spheres have disappeared. And that's because those were instance geometry. They only exist when that modifier is on my mesh. So while this is incredibly useful for complex mesh and things within Blender, because you can render these and have them there, and it can be a very good performance improvement if you're using instance geometry instead of full geometry. We're going to need full geometry if we're going to export to another package, such as Unreal. So this isn't going to work for us. And another thing to note, and a good way to kind of test what you're going to get when you go to export, is when you apply these, you're essentially doing the same thing as the export does. So if you go to File, Export, FBX Export, and then you go to Geometry, you'll notice that by default this Apply Modifiers is checked. So whenever you're exporting an FBX, if you have this checked, it's going to collapse your modifiers and essentially send as clean of data as possible, because an external program like Unreal or even like 3ds Max or Maya, they don't really know what Geometry Nodes is or how to use it. So with that, a good way to kind of give yourself a test of what you're going to see when you export is to collapse your modifiers first. All right, so what we need to do is we need to realize the spheres as actual geometry. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our sphere, an instance on points, and then we're going to realize instances and then join that geometry together instead. So I'm going to plug this into our output. So you'll notice that our object went gray, and if I go to edit mode, we've got the cube cross still. And you'll also notice that our UV attribute has a lot more data here, right? So like for each one of these spheres, it's got data for each one of those points of that sphere. But you also notice here in edit mode, I can't select these spheres. And the other thing that's interesting is if we go into the object data, our UV map attribute is still here. Now, this is something that is a little bit misleading because this attribute is actually the attribute without the modifier applied, right? So what data you're seeing in this spreadsheet is the data that we're going to get out from geometry nodes, but it's not going to show up here until you apply that data. So let's hit apply. So apply. And if we select all of our points, and you can see that we can manipulate our object like it's true geometry, but you'll also notice that even our cross is gone now, but we still have this attribute data. So let's take a look at our object data, and you'll notice that the UV maps is blank, but our UV map attribute has been converted to a standard attribute. So what ends up happening is when you're joining geometry together with geometry nodes, it has to convert your UV map domain data to generic attribute or a generic attribute to combine it together. So then because of that, all we have to do is convert our data back to a UV map. So it's going to start off as generic and then just switch that over to UV map and hit OK. And you'll notice that we now have a UV mapped object, and we can verify that by going into our edit mode and then back to object mode. So I'm going to do file, export, and I'm going to export this, and I'm going to bring this over to Unreal just as a verification. So import geometry nodes, and I'm not converting a scene and I'm not creating any materials, but other than that everything else is standard. And I'm going to open this up and go to UV, UV0, and you can see that this matches what we're seeing here in Blender. Well, I hope that helped, and I hope you have a great day.